Hey there guys, today we're going to be doing a comparison of these two mini PCs right here, that being the Bosgame P5 and the Bosgame P3. That is a $290 mini PC versus a $430 mini PC. Of course, don't let the naming confuse you. Just because this is a P5 and this is a P3 does not mean that this is better than the P3. This is rocking a Ryzen 5 6600H, while this is rocking a Ryzen 9 6900HX. So for $299, you can find this Bosgame P5 with 24 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM and a 512 gigabyte SSD. Meanwhile, for $430, you can get the P3, 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD. There are versions of this available for cheaper around the $350 price range if you want 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of SSD storage. But I think that if you're going with the P3, you are doing yourself a disservice to not get 32 gigabytes of RAM and the 1 terabyte SSD. But now the question is, between these two systems, what is the difference? Is it worthwhile to spend the $120 extra to go from the P5 to the P3? These are two of the best priced mini PCs that you can find on the market today, so I'm very curious to see if that jump is really worthwhile. So we're going to take a look at the performance of the chips between these two right now. Starting off, we're going to take a look at the CPU performance.
But I do want to point something out before we dive into the exact performance of these CPUs, and it's just the fact that we need the reality check that both of these systems will be able to do 99% of what the average person is going to want to do on a computer. When you look at benchmark numbers and you see massive gaps between two systems, you might start to think that one is multiple times better at doing tasks day to day than another, but that's really just not the case most of the time. So starting off with Cinebench R23, the P5 with its Ryzen 5 6600H ends up giving us a multi-core score of 10,115 and a single core score of 1,466. If we compare that to the P3 here with the Ryzen 9 6900HX, we're looking at multi-core performance of 12,392 and single core performance of 1,520. So there is definitely a noticeable improvement in the multi-core performance, though there is also a small improvement in the single core. This isn't too surprising. The 6900HX does have 2 more cores as well as a higher overall maximum clock speed on both the GPU and the CPU. So everything's falling within line on what you would expect it to be here. But as I mentioned before, both of these are very, very good CPUs for day-to-day tasks. So what does this translate to gaming performance? Well, let's jump on into some gaming benchmarks. So the first game that we're taking a look at is one of the biggest releases of 2024, and that is Marvel Rivals. Here it's running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings. We are using FSR at the performance preset, and as you can see, only one system here is giving us a pretty decent level of performance. Now I just want to clarify that this is a bot match, but it is not the same as doing a bot match in something like Counter-Strike. So these are bot matches, but just know that that is not affecting the performance at all, since the system itself does not need to render any of the bots. That is all server side. So the performance that I'm getting here is exactly the performance that you would get in the multiplayer. And as you can see, the P3 is the only one of these two systems that is really capable of playing this game at a remotely comfortable range. A title like this, you're definitely going to want to get as close to 60 and preferably above 60 as you possibly can. And unfortunately, that's just something neither one of these systems can do at the full 1080p resolution while relying on FSR. And speaking of FSR, there is frame generation in the game. And I know that some of you guys are going to see that on there and you're going to be tempted to turn it on to try it out. So I'm just going to let you know how that goes. Both of these systems with frame generation on seem to show some noticeable effects to the frame time chart. And it's very noticeable when you're playing the game because it really feels brutal to play because those 1% lows are just a disaster. The frame rate is just far too inconsistent to let frame generation have any benefit, and it's really only there to be a detriment. On the P5, you're also not even getting a high enough FPS to really benefit from from frame generation, as they recommend that you get at least a 60 FPS average before you start using something like frame generation. In my testing, I have found frame generation to help out in even sub 60 FPS scenarios, but the key to that is that the 1% lows and the average stay very close to each other. Essentially, you want as consistent of an experience as possible, and Marvel Rivals does not give you that. So because of that, the frame generation really exacerbates the problems that come with that inconsistent frame rate. Now, of course, I did try out Counter-Strike 2, another one of the most popular games in the world and consistently Steam's most popular game. And in this one, both systems ended up performing very, very similar to each other. Both of them give a great result, but there really isn't that big of a gap here. And that's pretty surprising to see, though. At the lowest in-game graphics settings at 1080p, we are a lot more CPU limited, and both of these CPUs are a lot closer to each other. You will see that the GPU is mostly at 100% utilization on both systems, but there will be those occasions where even on both systems it drops below 100, and that pretty much is showing you that you're running into a CPU limitation there. Of course, Black Myth Wukong was one of the biggest releases in general of this year, and here it is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings. We are using FSR to upscale, and that has a render scale of 67% being upscaled up to 100%, so that is 1080p, and we do have frame generation on. As you can see, the frame times on both of these are a lot smoother and a lot more consistent than what we saw in Marvel Rivals. The reason for that is, as you can tell, the 1% lows and the FPS average are far closer to each other. So because it's a more consistent experience, it does benefit from frame generation, at least in the built-in benchmark. When you're playing the game, the 660M is really struggling to give you even a 30 FPS average in some situations, and that fluctuation can really become a lot more apparent. So the built-in benchmark here isn't really showing you the true situation here, but both of them are far more playable with frame generation on than Marvel Rivals. Rivals was just absolutely egregious, while both of these are significantly more playable with the occasional stutter and hitch here and there. Of course, an all-time benchmarking classic that has really been putting a lot of systems to its knees is Returnal, here running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the performance preset. Both systems are really struggling to give you a decent experience in this title. This is a very heavy title, and neither system is going to give you a good enough experience on this title to justify even going through the effort of buying it. It is just way too heavy for these mini PCs. It really takes some of the highest end mini PCs on the market today to really push some good level of performance in this title, because again, remember, we are using FSR at the performance preset, and neither one of these systems is able to give us a good experience, though there is a noticeable lead for the 680M. At least in the FPS average, the 1% lows really narrow that gap a lot in comparison. And last but not least, we do have Hitman World of Assassination running at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR, but this time it's FSR at the quality preset. This is a very well optimized title. It's one of the reasons that it is in my favorite games ever. It runs really well. The support from the developers of this title has been absolutely insane. It's incredibly fun. It's an absolute joy to play, and it'll play really well on either one of these systems, because even on the P5, though we are getting a sub 60 FPS average, it's not by a lot, to the point where I could happily play with that level of performance. And if you do really want that 60 FPS gaming experience, instead of using FSR at quality, drop it down to balanced. That will give you enough of a bump that you're pretty much going to be at a 60 FPS average. Of course, the P3 here with its 6900HX is giving us a above 60 FPS average, pretty comfortably above 60 FPS, though the 1% lows are in their 40s. So the 1% lows between the two systems are very similar to each other, but the increase in the FPS average is noticeable. What this effectively means is that the 6900HX system is for the most part going to play better, but it isn't going to be as big of a a difference in terms of how it feels, as you would expect, just because the 1% lows are so similar to each other. So after seeing all of those numbers, what is the conclusion that we come to here? Well, me personally, I do think that the $120 to upgrade the storage, upgrade the RAM, upgrade the CPU, upgrade the GPU are all worth it. The P3 at the price point that it's at strikes a nice balance in terms of performance while also having tangible improvements in terms of the decisions for the hardware. So getting out of the box 1 terabyte, having 32 gigabytes of RAM, 8 Zen 3 Plus cores with 12 RDNA 2 cores is a very well balanced system. It's really just those gaming workloads that push these systems to their limit, and if gaming is important to you, I think the P3 is the way to go. But if you're looking for an overall general computer that is capable of doing at least some level of gaming, the P5 is the better choice, because you're saving yourself some money that you can throw towards storage, or really just having an all-around better computing experience by just buying yourself a nicer set of speakers, or buying yourself a nicer mouse or a nicer monitor. Save the money, get yourself the P5 if all you care about is having a very nice computer to use on the day-to-day. There are some quality of life improvements that came from the P5's design. In particular, my favorite thing is the fact that it has 2 USB-C ports on the back. That's a very welcome addition, though I do wish that it had the display port on the back as well, in the same way that the P3 does. I prefer having the USB-Cs, because either way, with the USB-Cs you can use a USB-C to DisplayPort cable. I am not a fan of front USB-C as the only USB-C. I like having front USB-C because it makes it a lot easier to plug in certain USB-C devices that aren't going to be permanently attached, but there are plenty of USB-C devices that would work permanently attached that you would rather have coming out from the back. But if you want my suggestion on what to get, I recommend the P3. That is the one that I would choose between these two if it was for me, but I care about the gaming performance of these systems a lot more than someone that just needs to do homework would probably care. And you might think, well, why doesn't that person just get something like an N100 system? And that might be more than enough to cover what they need to do, but I do think that the N100 is just a little too limited. But I think that the 6600H just provides the right balance of performance per dollar. But let me know what you think down below. I'll catch you guys in the next one.